Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with my High Elf Army Guide for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires campaigns. When we talk about the High Elves, most of the time, especially when it matters in a campaign, you're usually going to recruit 2 units, and maybe 3 really if you want them. Though the third, some people would just ignore them and instead go for a lot of spearmen and archers. And even then, there's a discussion. Do you want to use regular archers, which do not require barracks, or archers with light armor? So let's talk about that. Archers are a fairly good ranged unit, right? Ignore the fact they have martial prowess. I kind of wish there was a range version of martial prowess. I mean, you have yin and yang for cafe, so maybe a version of that, at least for campaigns, would be suitable. But regardless, they have a good amount of range, 180. They have a pretty good amount of range damage for a tier 1 unit. The difference between archers and archers with light armor is that regular archers have 15 armor, archers with light armor have 40, and a bit more melee defense if we look at it. Although, yeah, so that can be useful in terms of survivability and auto-resolve, and that's the reason I personally recruit archers with light armor in my campaigns as opposed to regular archers. The only time you want to recruit regular archers is if you can't get to barracks quickly enough or you have different priorities. That usually means that the only campaign where you're really going to recruit archers is Elfarian because of the situation he has. And even then, in his campaign, you're still going to recruit archers with light armor once you get that barracks up and running. It's just getting it up and running that's a bit of a problem, especially when we're talking about the Badlands. Then we have Spearmen. 40 armor, silver shields, really good early game unit that we talk about. Their melee defense is frankly ridiculous when we look at stats over here. So, though a lot of that does come from martial prowess, 12 of that comes from martial prowess, but Spearmen are one of the most effective early game units in the game. I mean, yes, you can talk about Jade Warriors from a pure armor perspective, but you have charge reflection, you have charge defense versus large, you have martial prowess, you do have that bonus versus large damage that Spearmen are doing. They're just a really good and effective unit. Not on their own, but in combination with archers. You have a line holder unit, you have a damage dealing unit. And you can, of course, use, checkerboard formation or all kinds of formations to make them, to make your army work. But this is the core of a high elf army, especially in those crucial early turns. The third unit to talk about are Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers, not from a damage dealing capability on the field of battle, because their damage, I'll be honest, is not strictly the best in the world. Yes, it's anti-large, yes, it's armor piercing. You can do quite a bit of damage with these guys, but only in a sustained environment. So basically, you need to be able to shoot at the enemy for long periods of time to really get the damage value proposition from Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers on a field of battle. Which is a problem because a lot of the enemies you're dealing with, you're talking about Sinnelleos, you're talking about Greenskins or Skaven, they're going to try and close the gap very quickly. The only situation where you can really maximize their output in a field battle is against Dark Elves, and even then that's kinda iffy with regards to that situation. Depends on the kind of unit composition they have. But it is your principal land-based, it's your only land-based artillery, so when you're dealing with siege situations, you're going to want Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers in your campaign, 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 of them. They're fairly easy to recruit, and the thing about High Elves is that they can get access to they do start really basically with tier 2. Like you look at Alariol, you look at Alifanar, you look at all the different campaigns, even Elfarian, right? It's like he does have that dual start, but then you have Torvres. So High Elves usually have the tier available to be able to get Eagle Claw bolt throwers relatively quickly. Whether or not you want to get them very, very quickly in a campaign, that's its own discussion. Then we have the Noble hero, the only hero that you can recruit at tier 2. One of the things I like to do in a campaign is get the Noble recruitment structure as quickly as possible and get the Noble. Very useful hero to have in your campaign, that melee damage capability, various skills that they provide. So, you know, having Nobles is pretty damn useful. Also, there's some traits, so you can use the load save character system to give yourself a bunch of different useful traits with respect to that. Army leader-wise, I think the early game choice really comes down to a Prince versus an Archmage, dependent on what you want to level. Now, here's the benefit of an Archmage. Magic school-wise, I think if you're playing the vanilla game, it will depend. Are you playing a campaign where you can get a lot of influence very quickly? So you can look at Lefanar, you can look at Alfarian, who can also get a good amount of influence very quickly. You can look at Tyrion, who earns a lot of influence from battles. But the benefit of Archmages is that even if you don't have influence, they do have a trait, the Ridicule trait, which you kind of don't care about because it just increases recruitment time of Phoenixes. So it's like, okay, just move the Lord out of the province and use something else to recruit them. The big benefit with Archmages is their magical capability, and they still get dragons. Not the best dragons, but if you're going to level a Lord, Archmages, while you lose the melee damage capability of a Prince, something like Fiery Convocation is not something to sneeze about. It's a heavy damage spell. So, and that's kind of thing, like high magic does require you to level up a Lord in order to really fully utilize it. And yeah, Arcane Art Forging and all that kind of stuff. The alternative is the Prince. The benefit of the Prince, beyond his melee damage capability, you know, all the skills that he can get, all that, the principal benefit, I would say, of a Prince is that he can have a bunch of very useful army buffing traits or, you know, upkeep benefits and all that kind of stuff. So, from my view, if you can get a Prince with a good trait early on, be it because you're playing a campaign where you get a lot of influence early on, or you're using the load save character system, then investing in a Prince is genuinely worthwhile. You know, Silver Shield, pretty good melee stats. Obviously, you're not going to win a duel against Nakari with the Prince, but a lot of the things you're dealing with, he can hold his own, if not outright win, against most other foes, most other lords you're going to be dealing with in a campaign. But that's your essential high elf army, your early game army, your mid game army. Hell, you can even push a lot of spearmen and archers with some Eagle Claw bolt throwers in late game, especially as you get more and more hero. For a mid game army, or just shortly after you've finished the early game, so we're talking about turn 20 to turn 30, you may be looking at an army like this, with Handmaiden, Mage, and Mistmage. Hero capacity is obviously a discussion, depends on victory conditions and how fast your growth is in settlements, but you will at least have one army with these kind of heroes. Lore Masters of Hoeth is a bit of a different discussion. Now, at this point in a campaign, Spearmen are still very useful to have, but you will want to replace them eventually with Silver and Guard. When you look at Silver and Guard, they're just the better unit flat out. More HP, better stats across the board that we do have. So, you know, you're looking at the significant combat capability, spell resistance, missile resistance, charge reflection, expert charge defense, and still martial prowess. Just better stats across the board, 75 armor, so they're going to be significantly more survivable than regular spearmen. And they're definitely worth it in every singular way to recruit in a campaign. They're the natural upgrade path for your units in a campaign, for your armies in a campaign. White Lions of Crix. Let's talk about this unit. I think it's at least worth talking about these guys, even though most of the time you really don't want to use them. So, the problem of White Lions of Crix is, yes, they could be considered decently durable, 90 armor, pretty solid melee stats, armor-piercing weapon damage. But I think I speak for a significant number of people when I say that in most High Elven campaigns, it's just not really worth it. Which is kind of weird considering the stats they have. You would think they would do quite well as a unit, but they really don't. They don't do great in auto-resolve. That's kind of an issue that a lot of, or all infantry units that have, that don't have a shield do suffer from. Unless you're talking about freaking Chosen and Warriors Gasp just because of their freaking durability. And also, something else to keep in mind. If you have an entire melee army, and this is why it works for Warriors of Chaos, if you have an entire melee army, individual units will take less damage. But if you have a hybrid army of ranged and melee, those melee units typically take the brunt of the damage in auto-resolve and, obviously, battles themselves, if the enemy does close the gap. Depends on how effective your ranged units are, but this is one of the reasons why Lions of Crix kind of don't really work out for a High Elven army. It's the combination of the fact that you have really good range units, and you want line holders for those range units. And in terms of melee damage dealing capability, you might want to get Chariots or Cavalry, though usually I would argue that you're better off waiting with regards to getting some of those units. Then there's Ladder and Sea Guard. If you with shields, I would not bother with the unshielded version. I would only get the version with shields, and that's just because they get the silver shield. They're not as good line holders, nowhere near as good line holders as Silver and Guard, though they can compete decently well with Spearmen. They do more damage in melee than Spearmen. So when we look at their stats, they have Charge Reflection, Charge Defense versus Large, and they're also aquatic, so if you're playing an Aceland campaign, you might want to get them as opposed to Spearmen. I wouldn't bother with Ship Company, but if you're playing a lot of naval battles, getting a unit that doesn't suffer from the penalty in water can be useful if you're fighting a lot of those quote-unquote naval battles in the game. There are no naval battles. Bow throwers still worth using. For siege capability, you might replace them later. But we also have a Ladder and Skycutters. So the things that I like about Skycutters is they're decently fast, and they're the only Eagle unit that I would say is, well, Hawk Riders, right, are worth it, but they do a good amount of damage, they have magical attacks, they have fire while moving, they do get momentum, which is not irrelevant, so that extra mass can be pretty useful. Like, basically, Skycutters are an effective chariot unit in terms of, like, their melee capability isn't the best in the world, but they can definitely engage in melee. Their principal value, though, is harassing the enemy from there, and the damage is there. Especially, if you're looking to harass specific units of an enemy army, they also cause fear as well. And it's kind of, it's kind of interesting, martial prowess on a flying ranged chariot unit. Though, don't underestimate their capability in melee. You might be surprised. Let me talk a bit more about heroes. So, Miss Mage you want for the campaign movement range. The magic itself is not necessarily the most important thing. Like, you have limited winds of magic. Sometimes you might want to use the spells, but it's really the principal reason you get Miss Mage is, some debuffs, obviously, some other spells, summoning a unit of ocean, and all that. But it's the campaign movement range. Handmaidens, the main reason you get Handmaidens is they provide, beyond, casualty replenishment, but that's not exclusive to them, the main benefit is they have an insanely good skill lines, and the best way to level them is in battle, not, for campaign actions. So you are incentivized heavily to get handmaidens as quickly as possible, and that's simply because handmaidens have a bunch of very, very good skills. They give you control, they give you influence, they give you diplomatic relations with all factions. So yeah, it's kind of like Diplomat of the Everqueen. So it's just a ridiculous combination of skills that make handmaids really, really useful on the campaign, not necessarily in battle. And then, of course, one mage, that's what you're going to get until you do your victory conditions, and then you just have a lot of heroes, and especially once you start getting settlements to tier 4, different schools of magic. Remember that both mages and archmages can get the administrator trait, which is just freaking ridiculous. You will grow your settlements much faster if you instantly construct stuff, and you will have a lot more money if you're abusing the administrator trait. But yeah, obviously you want mages for their magical capability, especially if you're not bringing an archmage lord in an army. For a more endgame army, you look at having all the hero types, and we will talk. I want to talk about the lord potential later on in a campaign. Obviously, an archmage is always going to be useful, so is a prince always going to be useful, but it's worth discussing the princess and the sea helm. So the princess is obviously not going to compare in terms of her melee capability to a prince. It's the question of skills rather than just skill lines in general, not just baseline stats that you might look at here, though obviously a prince does have better melee attack and melee defense when we compare the two of them. Though a princess can be useful with some of the skills that she has for buffing a ranged army. So what you're basically gaining by going with the princess, you still have a Star Dragon as a mount, but you lose that melee capability, that dueling capability in melee that the prince provides. She's just not going to compare for that. Obviously, she gains a range capability, and you can use that to skirmish with her, but still. Sea Helms, honestly, if there's a lord choice that I don't think is pretty much ever worth using, it's actually the Sea Helm. It's not because they're bad, it's just like, they don't get freaking dragons, and as a result of that, they're the least effective from a melee combat capability. Yeah, you can argue about them being more nimble on chariots and all that, but Sea Helms usually are mostly fluff to use in a campaign. Hero-wise, obviously, you have your nobles, you have your mages, you have your mismage, and then you gain the Lore Master of Hoev. So the Lore Master is a pretty solid duelist on foot. So if you're dealing with enemy lords on foot and you want someone to go up against them or enemy heroes, that's why you get the Lore Master as well as some other useful skills. He does have a bunch of magical abilities, but he's obviously not going to be quite effective as a mage. But mostly these skills are to help him in that dueling role. Replenishing, debuffing an enemy, buffing your armor, buffing your melee attack, melee defense. The bolt spell with Shem's Burning Gaze. That is what the Lore Master provides. I kind of wish you could recruit them earlier in a campaign, would make them better. Unless, you're playing Techless. Who does get that capability, well, at least. Well, Elfarian anyway. With Cavill especially. The duo of Batman and Superman. Then you have Sword Masters of Hoev, whereas White Lions are not worth it from my perspective. Sword Masters have a genuinely a decent argument in their favor. If you want a pretty good and, more importantly, available melee unit, Sword Masters will fill that role. They have a bronze shield, they have 100 armor, and they have martial mastery, which gives them 8 melee attack as long as their HP is greater than 25% and 12 melee defense. So their melee combat capability is pretty good. Not the best infantry units in the game, but considering the fact that you have ranged units aplenty to weaken an enemy before they even engage in melee, then having some sword masters in an army is worth it. It's just a shame that their tier requirements makes them a bit unavailable when it really matters. Then, if you really just want to replace archers in your army, I would not bother with Shadow Warriors. I don't think their combat benefits are worth the extra cost. But Sisters, if you just want a ranged unit to annihilate the enemy before they get in close, you got flaming attacks, magical attacks, with regards to them. So they're a very, very good ranged unit. And that's the reason you want to get Sisters, especially as Alariel, who gets them earlier in a campaign. But there is that question: is it worth getting an elite ranged unit, or is it worth it to spend that extra money on upkeep on getting an extra army of spearmen and archers? That's the real discussion with High Elves. Most of the time, getting better units is worth it in most campaigns, but with High Elves, the dynamic is of such a nature that your baseline armies are so damn good that replacing those baseline units, and this is even a discussion with Silvering Guard, may not necessarily be worth it. Though I think it's a less of a discussion with Silvering Guard compared to Sisters of Avalorn. Chariot-wise, the only chariot I would really work for, like, yes, you can use FLMR chariots early on in a campaign if you want to have flanking capability, but I view the White Lions of Crix, or rather the Lion Chariots of Crix, as an incredibly good chariot unit. Pretty good speed, 80 armor, bonus versus infantry, armor-piercing weapon damage, 70 charge bonus, causes fear, and missile resistance. What's there not to like about these guys? And one benefit to be said about High Elven Chariots in general is that they have 4 models for entities per unit, so at the highest army size. And what that means is they don't have the same pathfinding issues that quite a few chariot units with more models, more entities per unit do have. That's kind of one of the issues with greenskin chariots, for instance. Or, you know, pump wagons. Then we have the Skycutter Bolt Throwers. Now, this is a unit, like, if there's any higher end unit that you really, really want to recruit in a High Elven campaign, it's these guys. So, you have a flying artillery unit that can fire while moving. I would not strictly use their firing while moving capability, but it's still an artillery unit. And you still have pretty decent melee capability with these guys. A lot more range and a lot more effectiveness in battle. Like, you can fly over an enemy army, or you can engage an enemy army without being hit. And unlike regular bolt throwers, which obviously can struggle, obviously, you know, multi-shot is versus multiple targets. Like, you can really make good use of these guys in a prolonged battle because they're hovering across the enemy, or they can avoid anything that would hit them. You know, be it enemy flying units or enemy range units trying to pick them off, and they won't, you know, they won't have to deal with enemy flankers getting them out of position. Dragons, dragon-wise, moon dragons, if you want them. Obviously a fairly costly unit, but they are reasonably available in a campaign. And unlike Star Dragons, you don't get them at the point where your campaign is over, or you've basically cheesed your way there with Administrator. Because, by the way, you can do that. If you want Tier 5 units as the High Elves, you can just get a bunch of Administrator Archmages, as well as a Handmaiden with a trait that gives you an insane level of growth. There's some really ridiculous traits. There's some really ridiculous ways of abusing a High Elven campaign to get to even Tier 5 relatively quickly, especially if you're thinking about Alariel, because she can recruit Handmaidens through her skill line. So that makes... and Also, you can just confederate Alario, by the way. She's the easiest to confederate, so it's actually something that becomes available in other campaigns as well if you really push for that. But yeah, this is honestly, from a realistic standpoint, this is the kind of army you would... This is the most you're probably going to use in a campaign, or the most you need to use during the course of a campaign. But there's, of course, a couple of really high-end units worth talking. So in a longer campaign, or in a situation where you've abused things, or just because you're the kind of person who enjoys playing those 100-plus turn campaigns, units we're talking about are Phoenix Guard as an infantry unit. Now, they don't have a shield, which can be a issue in both auto-resolve, though they have 110 armor, so it's not as much of an issue as many other units. It's just that durability. They have a high level of leadership, and they're your ultimate flank holders. I wouldn't say they're necessarily the best against enemy infantry. If you look at chosen great weapons, they're going to demolish them. But outside of that, or win against them, I would say, not necessarily easily, because they have that high level of leadership. They also have 30% physical resistance, charge reflection, and expert charge defense, martial mastery, and immune to psychology. And they also cause fear, which, yeah, it's pretty good. An elite infantry unit that is difficult to get, but, you know, and expensive, of course, but may be worth getting if you just want... you know, it could be a strategy to make a purely infantry-based with monsters in a high-level campaign later on, because it is viable later on, not early on, but later on. Then we have Arcane Phoenixes. Usually, I'm not a fan of Phoenixes or Eagles. That's why I haven't talked about them. But Arcane Phoenixes just get shit done. A lot of the reason is because they do have this ridiculous vortex spell that can do a good amount of damage. They have ward save, physical resistance causes terror, and they're attuned to magic, so you get magical attacks and damage resistance. And on top of that, so flying, fire resistance, all that, and they have rebirth. So when they're about to die, they will many times revive themselves. That's one of the benefits, and obviously their stats are pretty solid all around for a combatant. If you want something that's faster and more nimble than a dragon, then yeah, Arcane Phoenixes are worth it. Then we have your Star Dragons. Yeah, just your big screw you unit. You send these guys, they go in, they have missile resistance, they have their Star Dragon breath attack, they do cause terror. It's a dragon. It's effective. What more needs to be said on that? I mean, one of the benefits of princes, princesses, and to some extent archmages, yes, archmages do get dragons, not Star Dragons though, unfortunately. It'd be cool. Though that might make them the most powerful lord in the game. Or the most powerful lord of the High Elves. Then we have Sea Elementals. I mean, many times I think this is a very situational unit, and it's also not great to have a unit that relies on you, on your unit dying to spawn Oceanids, or, you know, summon weaker unit when once dropping below 25% HP. I mean, it can be useful in that sense, and you do have that buff missile block chance stocks knife, or, you know, affecting the enemy as well. Decent enough from a combat capability, yes, but I think in terms of big single entities, there's just better stuff out there. And one of the weaknesses that you do have with regards to these guys is they're an elemental, so if their leadership falls, they'll just start collapsing, kind of like demons, and that's generally not a great thing. You want your units to rout, or, you know, revive if they die. These guys will just collapse. They're useful before they do so. They can do a good amount of damage, hold the line, but still, if you lose their those leadership, it's kind of like Kadai. So, but Kadai are a far more available unit, and it doesn't hurt you as much to lose a Kadai unit as it does to lose a Sea Elemental. Then we have the Merworm. Now, the Merworm is a big, chunky boy, kind of like your rogue idol for the High Elves, though much faster than a rogue idol. Not as durable as a rogue idol, but here's the thing. You get Wall Breaker, which means you don't even need Siege if you get a Merworm, though that's only effective. That only really matters very late on in the campaign if you could recruit the Merworms faster. Different discussion, I would dare say. I think Wall Breaker is one of those traits that really should be available far more often. I mean, I don't see why dragons can't have Wall Breaker, but that's just my perspective. They're weak to fire, but the main benefit of Merworms, here's where they do very well. One, they have aquatics, Aislinn in particular, but quite crucially, they have that bonus versus large. The single best role for a Merworm is to deal with enemy monsters. So big single entities, Merworms will usually win those engagements because of their sheer amount of damage. And that's why you may want to recruit them if you're starting to deal with a bunch of single entities during the course of your campaign, you know, endgame crises or some AI opponent that's recruited them. Or who knows, maybe multiplayer campaign, someone trying to win with a bunch of single entities. Yeah, different strategies in multiplayer campaigns, but Merworms are useful. It's just a shame they're not so available in a campaign. Like, you don't have the flexibility of a dragon, but Wall Breaker in its own makes this a useful unit. The days when regular ogres would have Wall Breaker, that was ridiculous. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Stay tuned for more. And let me know what you guys think.